To recreate this dashboard, we'll build a background and layout with rounded corner containers. For the visuals, we'll start with a gradient area chart and make it conditional with a toggle button, so users can switch between two metrics like price and volume. We'll also create time period buttons so users can filter the area chart by this month, this year, and last year. We'll add KPIs to display the current metric value and the year-to-date change, and we'll make the color of the box and text and the direction of the arrow responsive to whether it's a positive or negative change. For overall progress, we'll design a partial donut chart where we can control how much of the donut is shown. To show the progress for each initiative, we'll build a gradient progress line chart with circle markers and apply conditional coloring to the lines and circles based on the progress value. The first set of data I'll be using for this dashboard is stock data. So I'm going to click on the sheet and drag that into the view. This data set contains a date, the stock price, and the volume. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a new worksheet for our background. I'll create a calculated field called box and just put 2 quotes in it. Then I'll drag that calculated field into the marks and change it to text. And you can see when I hover over it, there's some text. So I'm going to go to the tooltip and remove everything in there. And now we have a blank box. So I'm going to right click, go to Annotate, Area, and hit OK. And I want this to be set to the entire view. To get rounded corners, I'm going to right click Format within our box, and I'll go to Shading and change it to be a tan color at 100%. And I'll set the corners to be rounded. And once I get this somewhat centered, I'll create a dashboard. I'll change the objects from tiled to floating and drag my background worksheet on. I'll hide the title, and then I'll go to the size of the dashboard and change the width to be a little bit wider, like 1,330. Then within the layout, I'm going to change the positioning to be 0, 0, and change the width and the height of our background to be the same as our dashboard size. To give us some containers to put our charts in, I'm going to click on an area on the worksheet that's not within our box. I'll right click, go to Annotate Area, and hit OK again. Then I can resize this box to be about where I want the chart to be. Then I'll right click, Format, and under Shading I'm going to change it to white at 100%, and I'll make the corners more rounded. I'll repeat this process for a few more boxes to put our charts in. And once I get those boxes positioned, we now have a background for our dashboard. Under the objects on the left, I'm going to drag in a text box so I can give a title to our dashboard. I'll call this Market Trends and Business Goals. Then I'll select the text and change the font to be Tableau Regular. I also want this to be black, and I'll change the size to be 22. To add a little bit more spacing between our first and second line, I'm going to hit Enter after our first line, then I'll type a space, and I'll change the font of that space to be 2. There's no native way to control the line spacing and text in Tableau, so that's why I like to use an extra line and just control the spacing using the font size. Then I'll copy and paste our text box for the title, and I'll call this one Market Activity. This will be for the first chart we create, which is going to be a gradient area chart. To create the first chart, I'm going to create a new worksheet called Gradient Area Chart. And there are 3 calculated fields we'll need to create for this. So I'll create a calculated field, and this first one will be for our normalized metric. And for this, I'm going to start with one metric, price. So I'll type the sum of our price minus the window minimum of the sum of the price. And that's going to be in parentheses, and I'll divide that by the window max of the sum of the price. And then I'll subtract the window minimum of the sum of the price. This formula calculates how much each price compares to the lowest and highest prices within the dataset. And it transforms these prices into a scale of 0 to 1, where 0 is the lowest price in the group and 1 is the highest price in the group. And I'm going to copy this formula because it's going to have the same structure as our normalized date. So I'll create another calculated field called norm date, and I'll paste our norm metric formula in here. And everywhere where there's a sum, I'm going to change it to the minimum. And everywhere there's a price, I'm going to change it to our date field. So this calculated field is doing the same thing as our last one, except for this time we're comparing each date to the highest and lowest date within our dataset. And lastly, to ensure that our gradients doesn't go above the path that we set, I'm going to create another calculated field for the reversed metric. And this one will just be 1 minus our normalized metric. So it'll be like a normal area chart, but just flipped upside down. To create the structure, I'm going to pull our normalized date into the columns, and I'll pull our normalized metric into the rows, and our reverse metric into the rows. And then under the all marks, I'll move our date field. And I don't want this to be in years, so I'm going to right click and choose the day. And then I'll right click again to make it discrete. The reason I added this field in here is because we're going to have our formulas compute using that date. So I'll right click on our norm date field, go to compute using, and choose date. And I'll do the same process for norm metric and the reversed metric. So you can see how the bottom chart, which is our reverse metric, is just the flipped version of our normalized metric. To get this on the same axis, I'm going to right click on our reverse metric field and choose dual axis. So you can easily see here how the reverse one just flips it upside down. But we don't need the coloring, so I'm going to remove measure names from the all marks. And under the first mark, I'm going to change it from a shape to a line. And under the second mark, I'll change it to an area. For the color, I want to set it to white at 100%. And on our left axis, I'm going to right click and edit the axis. I'll give this a custom range between -0.05 and 1.05. Then I'll right click and move marks to the front. That way our line chart appears in front of our area. I'll also edit our right axis and give it that same custom range between -0.05 and 1.05. Then under the scale, I'm going to check off the reversed. So now our area chart that has a white background is everything above the line. This will contain our gradients to everything below the line. To add the gradients, I'm going to go to the Map tab at the top, choose Background Images, and choose our stock data source. And I'll add an image that I created from Canva, which is just a gradients. For the normalized date, I'm going to set it from 0 to 1. And for the Y field, I'm going to choose our normalized metric and also set it from 0 to 1. Then under options, I like to uncheck locking the aspect ratio. And now that we have our gradients, you can see there's a little bit of white part between our line and our area chart. So I'll go to our first mark, and for the color, I'm going to choose the same color as the top of our gradients. And to get rid of that little white part, I'm going to remove the halo effect. For formatting, I'm going to remove all 3 headers. And then I'll format the worksheet, and I'll remove the row divider and the column divider. And under the lines, I'm going to remove the 0 lines for the sheet, so we're left with just the gradient area chart. So going back to our dashboard, I'm going to pull our gradient area chart worksheet on, and I'll hide the title and resize it. Right now, we can see the overall trend, but without the axes showing dates and values, It's hard to tell exactly when things happened or how big the changes were. So to add the date access, I'm going to create a new worksheet called Access. And for this, I just need to pull our date field into the columns, and then I'll right-click and make it a day. That way it matches our gradient area chart. Then I'll change it from automatic to a polygon. And we know what these dates represent, so I'm going to right-click, edit the access, and I'll get rid of the title. Then on our dashboard, I'm going to add our access worksheet. I'll hide the title and I'm going to resize it so it's underneath our gradient area chart. And I'll also set this up to fill the entire view. The gradient area chart ends pretty abruptly on both sides. So instead of having the width of the worksheet match the width of the white container, I'm going to pull it a bit further out so that the end of the gradient area chart is aligned with the end of the white container. And you can see right now there's a bit of white on the outside, so I'm going to right-click Format, go to Shading, and change the shading to be None. And now I can pull it out so that the end of our area chart matches the end of our white container. And now that I have that aligned where I want it, I'm going to right-click Format on our dates, and I'll make it a little bit darker and increase the size. But because we're using normalized fields to create this gradient area chart, the tooltip doesn't give us a good idea of what the values are. So I'll go back to our area chart worksheet, and under the second mark, I'm going to go to the tooltip and remove everything in there for area. And for the line, we can see that day is already in there, so I'm going to add in our price field. Now we can edit the tooltip, and I'm going to remove everything in there that isn't the date field or the price field. And I'll format the date field to be a little bit larger. And I'll just add a $sign in front of the price so it's clear what that value represents. And now when I hover over one of the points in our line, it's clear what the price is on that day. But if I were to add all the values onto the chart, it'd become extremely cluttered. So instead, I'm going to add the maximum and minimum points so we can better estimate where any other point falls by seeing how close it is to these extremes. And this will give us a clear sense of how all the other values are spread out. To add the max and minimum, I'm going to go back to our area chart worksheet, and under the first mark, I'm going to change the sum of our price to a text. And you can see how this quickly clutters our dashboard. So I'll go to the label and the marks, and I'll choose min max to display only the minimum and maximum values. This chart does a great job of showing the trend of the stock price over time. But to make it even better, we could add another metric like volume for the same time period, so we can switch between stock price and volume. And that'll give us a more complete picture of the market activity. To create this conditional area chart, we'll need to edit our normalized metric field. But that calculation can only be computed using one field's values. And right now our price and volume are separate fields. To make them one field, I'll go back to our data source. And I'll select our volume and price fields, and then right-click and pivot. This is a workaround I like to use for being able to use measure values and measure names within calculated fields. So now you can see we have one field that has all the values for volume and price. Now if we go back to the area chart, you can see we have some fields that are red because price is no longer a field. So I'm going to edit our normalized metric field, and instead of price, I'll use the pivot field values. And I'll just go through and replace all those. And there's still one red field, that's why we can't see the chart yet. So I'm going to go to the first mark, and instead of the sum of the price, I'll pull in the pivot field values. But since we're using the pivot values, which contains both the volume and the price, we're seeing both of those in the chart. To see only one at a time, I'm going to pull the pivot field name into the filters. And I'll start off with checking off just price. Then I'll right-click to show the filter on the worksheet. And now we can filter to choose which metric we want to see on the chart. But it'd be even more helpful if the gradient color changed based on which metric is selected. So when price is selected, we'll see a blue gradients, and when volume is selected, we'll see a green gradients. To do this, I'll need to pull our pivot field names into the columns next to norm date. And I don't want the label, so I'm going to hide the label and hide the header. Then I'll go to the Map tab at the top and choose Background Images and select our stock data source. I'll click on the current background image that we're using and hit Edit. And then under the Options tab, I'll add a condition. I'll select the field Pivot Names and choose Price. So the chart will only show the background image with the blue gradients when price is what's selected. For volume, I'll need to add another image, and I'll choose a green gradient background. And we'll set this up the same as we have the other one, where the norm date is between 0 and 1, and the norm metric is between 0 and 1. Under the Options tab, I'll uncheck locking the aspect ratio, and then I'll add a condition and say when the pivot field name is volume. So now we can use this filter on the right to toggle between the price and the volume. But you can see the line itself is blue no matter what, and I want that to match the top of the gradients, whether it's green or blue. So to make that line conditional, I'll add our pivot field names into the first mark, and I'll change that to a color. Then I'll edit the legend for that color, and since we're doing green for volume, I'm going to choose a green. I created these custom color palettes already, but I have another video for how to do that. Then I'll switch it from volume to price, and I'll edit the legend for the color for price and choose a blue. So now we've assigned a color for our gradient area chart and our line for each metric. To allow users to be able to filter, we can go back to our dashboard, and I'll click on the chart and do the down arrow, go to Filters, and choose the Pivot Field Names. Then you can go to the down arrow on the filter and choose one of the single value options. So users are able to toggle between our metrics, price, and volume. And you can do even more metrics than just these two. And while a single drop-down filter is effective, a more intuitive way to allow users to switch between volume and price is with a toggle switch. And using a toggle switch, we can make the color of the toggle switch and the labels responsive to the metrics. So the metric that's selected will match the color of the area chart. So on a new worksheet, I'm going to create a parameter. I'll call this the toggle param and set the data type to a string. For the current value, I want to leave this empty. Then I'll right-click to show the parameter on the worksheet. For the toggle switch, we need two calculated fields. So I'm going to create a calculated field called toggle-select. In here, I'll say if the toggle parameter is equal to the pivot field names, then true, else false. So this formula will return true when it's selected and false when it's not. I'll create another calculated field and call this toggle-name for param. In here, I'll type if the toggle parameter equals price, then return volume, else return the price. So if the parameter is set to price, the output will be volume. And if the parameter is set to anything other than price, the output will be price. To build the structure of the toggle, I just need to drag the toggle name for param field into the marks. And I'm going to change this from automatic to a shape. And I want our name for param field to determine the shape. So going back to the dashboard, I'll add our toggle switch worksheet. I'll hide the title and set it to the entire view. Because we're using the value in our parameter to determine what's shown in the graph, we can go to the dashboard tab at the top, hit Actions, and add a parameter action. This will allow us to add the switch functionality for our toggle. For the source sheet, I just want to have the toggle switch worksheet checked off. I want to target the toggle param using the toggle name for param as the source field. And now when I click on our switch, you can see it changes between a circle and a square based on whether volume or price is selected. But I don't think a circle or a square is a good visual representation of what is being selected. So I'll edit the shape for our legend, and I'll choose this Filter Images shape palette that I loaded in here. But I have another video for how to load custom shapes. So whatever's in our parameter, which in this case is volume, is going to be the opposite of what's shown on our graph. So it might seem counterintuitive, but for volume, I'm going to add the toggle I want when price is selected. And since price is blue in our graph, I'm going to add the blue toggle. Then I'll click on our toggle button to switch it. And then I'll edit the shapes for the legend. And since this is going to represent when volume is selected, I'm going to choose a green toggle. So now I have the functionality to switch the toggle between price and volume, but I haven't linked anything to our chart yet. So I'll go back to our area chart worksheet, and I'll remove the filter for the pivot field names. And instead I'll drag the toggle select field into the filters and set it to only true. So now when I use the toggle to switch between volume and price, the chart updates with that metric. And the toggle's looking super small right now, so I'm going to go back to our toggle switch worksheet, and I'll use the size slider in the marks to increase the size. To avoid confusion, I'm going to go to the tooltip and remove everything that's in there. This is because the field that's in there is actually the opposite of what's being represented in our chart. One option for labels is to add the text price on the left of the toggle and volume on the right. But to make it even more clear to users which is selected, I want the label to be responsive. So when a metric is not selected, I want it to have a black label. And when a metric is selected, I want the color of the label to match the color of the toggle and the area chart. So on a new worksheet, I'll start by adding pivot field names to the columns. And I'll add that same field to the marks twice. I want one to be a label and the other to be a color. To make the color also responsive to whether it's selected or not, I'll add our toggle select field into the marks and change it to a color. Then I'll edit the colors for the legend, and for a false, I want to choose black. And when volume is true, I want it to be green. Then on a dashboard, I want to add our switch labels worksheet. And I'm going to click the toggle so that it switches. And then I'll edit the color of the legends, and for false, I want to do black again. For true, I'll do blue so that it matches our area chart and our toggle for price. And now when I click on the toggle to switch between price and volume, the color of the label is responsive to both the metric and whether or not it's selected. For formatting, I'll hide the title, and then I'll right-click and uncheck Show Header. Then I'll format the worksheet, and I'm going to make the font a little bit bigger and a little bit darker. And under alignment, I'm going to go to the horizontal alignment and choose center. For shading, I'm going to change the worksheet shading to none. And under the borders, I'm going to remove the row divider. Then I'll set our label worksheet to the entire view. And I'll resize it so that the toggle's in between the labels. To get the toggle in front of the labels, I'll go to the Layout tab, and I'll move the toggle switch ahead of the labels. Then I'll right-click Format on our toggle, go to Shading, and change it to be None. Now instead of using Tableau's default filter to switch between price and volume, we have a more intuitive way to filter. And since the color of the toggle and label are responsive to the selected metric, it's immediately obvious to users which metric they're viewing. So it also doubles as a built-in legend. Currently, we're viewing 2 years worth of data, and I want the user to be able to select what time period they're looking at. So on a new worksheet, I'll call this Time Filter. I'm going to create a parameter, and I'll call it Time Period Param. I'll set the data type to a string, and for the allowable values, I'll do a list. I want the users to be able to choose between this month, this year, and last year. Then I'll right-click and show the parameter on the worksheet. Then I'll create a calculative field for the general time identifier. And this is how we're going to categorize the different dates into certain time periods. So for the first line, I'm going to do the month of the date equals the month of today, and the year of the date equals the year of today. So if the date falls within the current month and year, it'll return this month, comma, this year. The next time period I want to categorize is this year. So I'll say if the year of the date equals the year of today, then this year. And lastly, I want to check for last year. So I'll say if the year of the date equals the year of today minus 1, then last year. So now that we have these general time periods categorized, I also want to do a specific time identifier. So I'm going to copy what we have in here because it's going to be very similar. So I'll create a new calculative field called specific time identifier, and I'll paste our formula. On the first line, I'll remove the text this year, so we're left with just this month. And now that we have the dates categorized, I need to create another calculated field to determine if it's selected or not. For time select, I'm going to type if the specific time identifier contains the time period parameter, then true, else false. So this formula checks if the specific time identifier contains the time period value in the parameter. To build the structure for our filter buttons, I'm going to move the general time identifier into the columns. Then I'll pull the specific time identifier into the marks and make it a label. So the only difference here is that our general identifier contains the text this year for this month, and our specific one only contains this month. So while we need the specific one for the label, we'll use the general one for filtering. I'll also pull our time select field into the marks and make it a color. And then I'll change the mark type from automatic to a shape. Under shapes, I'll choose a square, and this will give us a basic filter button. And I can increase the size using the size slider in the mark. But I personally prefer rounded corners, so I'm going to go to shapes and choose more shapes. Then I'll select a custom palette I created, and I'll choose a rounded corner container. I'll increase the size a little bit, and then I'll go to the label, and for the alignment, I want it to be horizontally and vertically centered. I'll also change the font to be a little bit bigger and a little bit darker. Then I'll use the legend on the right to edit the colors. And I'll use a custom color palette I created so that false is a light beige and true is a darker version of that color. For formatting, I'm going to right-click on the header and uncheck Show Header. Then I'll right-click Format the Worksheet, and under the borders, I'm going to remove the row divider. And the boxes are looking a bit small, so I'm going to use the size slider to increase the size of them. I also want the most recent to be on the left side, so I'm going to right-click on our general time identifier field and hit Sort. And I'll sort by manual so I can do this month first, then this year, then last year. On a dashboard, I'll add our time filter worksheet. I'll hide the title of the worksheet, get rid of our parameter and our legend, and then I'll set the worksheet to the entire view. To add functionality to our filter buttons, I'll go to the Dashboard tab at the top, go to Actions, and I'll add a parameter action. For the source sheet, I only want to have the time filter worksheet checked off. I'll be targeting our time period parameter and using the specific time identifier as the source field. And now I can interact with the buttons that turn darker when they're selected. But it's still not actually filtering our area chart yet, and that's because we need to go back to the area chart worksheet and bring our general time identifier field into the filters. Under conditions, I'll do it by formula, and I'll say contains general time identifier, comma, the time period param. And then I'll right-click on our filter, go to Apply to Selected Worksheets, and choose our Access worksheet. That way the filter buttons work on both the area chart and the Access worksheet. And now we can use our time period filter buttons to filter our area chart. Next, I want to add the price and volume for today and the year-to-date changes. I'll start off with our KPI for price, and I'll create a calculated field for the price for the year-to-date. This first line I'm typing will give us the price today. So it's saying if the date equals today and the pivot field names equals price, then take the sum of the pivot field values. So this will give us the final value, and I want to subtract the original value, which is the price on the first day of the year. So the second line will say if the date equals the first day of this year, and the pivot field names equals price, then take the sum of the pivot field values. Then I'll wrap this whole thing in parentheses and I'll divide it by the original price, which is the second line. So I'm going to copy and paste that second line. This formula is doing final minus original divided by original, and that will give us the year-to-date change. I'll drag this formula into the marks and change it to a text. Then I'm going to format the field so that it's a percentage. For today's price, I'm going to pull in the pivot field values into the marks. Then I'll edit the title and get rid of what's in there. I'll type a $sign and insert our pivot field values. And I'll add the text today. For the price, I'm going to make it bold, and for the text today, I'm going to make it a bit smaller. But this is summing up everything. So I need to pull the pivot field names into the filters and select price. Then I'll pull the date into the filters and choose a relative date. And I'll choose today. So now we have the price for today and the year-to-date changes for price. Under the marks, I'm going to change it from automatic to a shape. And within the shapes, I'm going to choose a square and increase the size of it. And then I can use the color in the marks to change the color of the square. And while this is effective at showing the price today and the year-to-date change, to make it even more impactful, I'm going to make the color and text within the year-to-date box responsive to whether it's a positive or negative change. To do this, I'll create a calculated field for when the price is increasing. So this is saying if the year-to-date price is greater than 0, then do the string of the year-to-date price plus a percentage and an upward arrow. And I'll drag this into the marks to replace our price year-to-date. And you can see there's a lot of decimals in here because we're taking the string of it. So I'm going to edit our field and do the left 4 digits. But now it's too small because we're translating into a percentage, so I'm going to multiply our field by 100 first. And now that we have the condition for the increase, I'm going to duplicate that field and I'll edit it for the decrease. In here, I just need to change the greater than to a less than. And I'll change the upward arrow to a downward arrow. Then I'll add this field into our marks and change it to a text. And you can see nothing changed when I added the decrease field in here because the change was positive. Within the label of the marks, I'm going to edit the text and make the decrease red and the increase green. Then I'll add the text YTD for year to date and make it black. This way, if there's a positive change, it'll show green text and an upwards arrow. And if there's a negative change, it'll be red text with a downward arrow. Under alignment, I'll center this horizontally and vertically. To change the color of the box to be responsive as well, I'll create another calculated field for the box color for price. So this line is saying if the price increase field is not null, then make it green. else red. I'll drag this field into the marks and make it a color. Then I'll go to the legend and edit the colors. And since this is going to be green, I'm going to make it a green color. I'm also not a big fan of sharp edges, so I'm going to go to Shape, choose More Shapes, and pick this rounded corner container that I loaded into my shapes. Then I'll decrease the size so we can see it better. On a dashboard, I'll add our KPI price worksheet. I'll resize and set this to the entire view. You can see the title is aligned on the left, whereas the box is centered. So I'll edit the title and put a few spaces at the beginning to move it to the right. And now that we have our price KPI, I want to set up something similar for our volume KPI. Since this will use the same structure, I'm going to duplicate our KPI price worksheet. And I'll rename it to be volume. I'll duplicate our price year-to-date field and then edit it. So this will be for our volume for year-to-date, and everywhere there's the text price, I'll replace it with volume. Then I'll duplicate our increase and decrease fields, and I'll edit our increase field to be the volume increase. And everywhere there's a price year-to-date, I'll change that with our volume year-to-date field. And I'll do the same process for the volume decrease. Then I'll replace our price increase and decrease fields with our volume ones. And you can see there's a negative in front of our percent change, which I already captured with the downward arrow. So I'll edit our volume decrease field and put the absolute value of our integer. And now we don't have a negative in there. So I'm going to do the same thing for our price decrease. I'll also duplicate our price box color, edit the field, and for this one, instead of the price increase, I'll just change this to the volume increase. And then I'll replace our price color with our volume color. And I'll use the legend to edit the colors. And I'll choose a light red or a pink for this one. But the title is still the price, so I need to edit our filter for the pivot field names and choose volume instead of price. Then I'll edit our title, get rid of the $sign, and type the unit afterwards, which is trades. Going back to our dashboard, I'll add our KPI for volume. Then I'll resize, and I'll set it to the entire view. And now that I've got that position where I want it, we now have two KPIs for the price and the volume and the year-to-date changes for both. And the next element I'll add to this dashboard is a partial donut chart. And I'll set this up using a filler so we can choose how much of the donut we want to show. So first I'll go to Data tab and choose a new data source. I'm going to use this Excel file that has this sheet for business initiatives. So I'll pull that sheet into the view. And you can see this just has two fields, the initiatives and the progress made toward that initiative. So on a new worksheet, I'm going to create a parameter. I'll call this filler, and for the current value, I'm going to set this to 0.3. Then I'll right-click and show the parameter on the worksheet. Then I'll create a calculated field for the first segment of a donut chart. This field will calculate the size of the first segment. So if the average progress is greater than 50%, it limits the first segment to half of the remaining space after accounting for the filler. Otherwise, it sets the first segment to the average progress value adjusted by the filler. Then I'll create another calculated field for the remainder. This field calculates the size of the segment that represents the remaining progress beyond 50%. So if the average progress is greater than 50%, it calculates the excess progress and adjusts it according to the filler. So the excess progress is the average progress minus 50%. And then to adjust it by the filler, I'll multiply it by 1 minus the filler. And if it's 50% or lower, the segment's not needed, so it sets it to 0. And lastly, I'll create a calculated field for the progress that's not met yet. So this field calculates the size of the segment that represents the progress that hasn't been achieved. This formula checks if the progress is more than 50%. If it is, it calculates how much progress is left to reach 100%, adjusting for the filler value. And if the progress is 50% or less, it returns 0.5 adjusted by the filler. The filler parameter controls the portion of the donut chart that's displayed. It's cutting out a section to create a partial donut chart rather than a 360-degree one. And our filler is 0.3, which means 30% is reserved and 70% remains for the data. Multiplying each of these fields by 1 minus the filler ensures that each segment is proportionally adjusted. To create the structure of a donut, I'll type the minimum of 0 twice into the columns. Then for the first mark, I'll change it from automatic to a pie. And I'll drag measure values into our first mark. And I want the measure values to determine the angle. I'll get rid of any measure values that we don't need, so we're left with just our 3 calculated fields. And then I'll pull our filler parameter into the measure values. Then I'll pull measure names into our first mark and make this a color. Because Tableau starts its pies at 12 o'clock, we need to order our measure values so that the remainder is first. And you can see how that moved the remainder to start at 12 o'clock. I'll move not yet so it's second. And that'll move the slice of the pie to be right after the remainder. Then I'll leave filler at third, which will make it cover the bottom portion of our pie. And then last will be the first segment. To get the donut effect, I'll go to the second mark and change this to a circle. Then I'll use the color to make it white. Now I can right-click on either one of our minimum of zeros and make it a dual axis. Under the first mark, I'll use the size slider to make it bigger. And under the second mark, I can use the size slider to determine the thickness of the donut. Then I'll edit the colors in our legend. The first segment and the remainder represent how much progress has been made. So I'm going to make both of these a green color. And filler is the part that we don't want to see, so I'm going to make this white. And since not yet is the portion remaining, I'll make this a beige color. And now we can change the filler parameter to determine how much of the donut chart we want visible. So we can make it appear more like a gauge or dial chart. And the higher I set the filler, the less of the donut chart is shown. So I'm going to set this to 0.3. And while we can visually see this is about 60%, I want to add the progress field into the second mark. Then I'll right-click and make it an average. And I'll change this to text. Under the label and the marks, I'll center this horizontally and vertically. Then I'll edit the text to make it larger. Currently, the text is centered vertically within our circle. But since our donut chart is partial, the text isn't centered within the visible portion of the donut chart. A quick workaround for this is to hit Enter and type something like a period. Then change the color of the font to white so it matches our circle color. And then you can use the font size to determine how much you want to move the text up. And also right-click Format on our progress %, and I'll change this to a percentage with no decimals. And I want to show a quick adjustment we need to make if our progress is less than 50%. So in this example, it's 31%, so I need to create another calculated field. I'll call this not yet less than 50%. And this formula is checking if the average progress is greater than 50%, and if it is, it returns 0. If the progress is 50% or less, it calculates how much is needed to reach 50% and adjusts it based on the filler value. This field is necessary if we're less than 50% because we need to accurately show the unfinished part of the donut chart. And I'll pull this calculated field last in our measure values. So now you can see how that proportionally adjusts each slice of the pie. I'll then use the legend to edit the colors, and I'll set this to the same color we have for our original not yet field. Now regardless if we're less than or over 50%, our partial donut chart will be accurate. For formatting, I'll remove the headers. Then I'll format the worksheet and go to the borders to remove the row and column dividers. And under lines, I'll remove the 0 lines for the sheet and the grid lines for the columns. Then on a dashboard, I'll add our donut chart worksheet. Then I'll hide the title of the worksheet and I'll set this to the entire view. And you can see while I'm trying to center this donut, there's a bit of white at the bottom because we're using a filler. So even if I turn my worksheet to no shading, there could still be some white at the bottom. To get around this, I'm going to bring in a text object. Under the Layout tab, I'll go to Background, and I'll change this to the same shading as my background. Then I'll reposition it so it covers any spillover from our donut chart. I'm also going to copy and paste one of the other text boxes. Then I'll edit the text so that it says Overall Progress. And after I get that position where I want it, we now have a partial donut chart. And we can control how much of the donut is displayed using the filler parameter. I did it here simply for the design of it, but these are really useful for dial and gauge charts, where you don't want the full donut showing. The next element I'll add to this dashboard are progress lines. To build the structure of this, I'm going to move the measure values into the columns, and I'll move our metric, which is the progress %, into the columns as well. For rows, I'm going to pull in our initiative field. And under the measure values, I'll type 0, and I'll type 1. And then I'll remove all the fields that aren't the 0 and the 1. So you can see here, 0 and 1 will be the start and end. That way we have lines of equal length, and we can show the progress of each initiative with circles that fall along that line. And I'm not a big fan of these sharp edges, so I'm just going to go to the measure value mark and make it a line. Then I'll pull our measure name field in and make that determine the path of the line. Then using the size slider and the marks, I'll increase the size. So you can see we get these rounded edges. So while the chart on the left will show us the full length lines representing 100% or the total lines, the chart on the right will display the progress percentage for each initiative. And I want these to be circles, so I'm going to go to the second mark and make it a circle. Then to align these on the same axis, I'll right-click on our progress % and make it a dual axis. For formatting, I'll remove both headers. Then I'll format the worksheet, and under borders, I'll remove the row divider and the column divider. Under lines, I'll remove the 0 lines for the sheet and the grid lines for the columns. To give each line its own color, I just need to move the initiative field into the first mark, and then I'll make it a color. And for the circles to match the coloring of the lines, I'll go to the second mark and move initiative in and make it a color. But since these circles represent the progress made towards each initiative, I want to apply some conditional formatting so that the progress lines and circles change colors based on the progress percentage. So to implement the conditional formatting logic, I'll create a calculated field. For this field, I'll say if holding fixed the initiative, the sum of the progress is greater than 0.7 or 70%, then assign it the value green. Else if, holding fixed the initiative, the sum of the progress is less than 0.3 or 30%, then assign it the value red. And if it doesn't match either of these conditions, assign it the value yellow. To implement the conditional coloring, I'll go to the All Marks and drag our calculated field in. I also want to create a gradients with our conditional coloring, so I'm also going to drag measure names into our All Marks. Then I'll change both of these to be a color. Using the legend, I can edit the colors. Since 0 will represent the left side of our line, I'm going to choose a light color. 1 will represent our right side of our line, so I'm going to choose a darker color. And the progress percent will be the circle, so I'm going to choose an even darker color. That way we get this gradients from light green to darker green, with the circle being the darkest green. I'll do the same thing for our reds and our yellows. And now we have gradient lines with conditional coloring that make it easy to see progress at a glance. And right now you can see if I hover over the circle or the line, there's a lot of information in the tooltip that we don't need. So I'll go to our line mark, and in the tooltip, I'm going to remove everything. Within the circle mark, I'll go to the tooltip, and I'll remove everything except for the sum of our progress. But now when we hover over it, it's in decimal form. So I'm going to right-click Format on our progress percent field, and change this to a percentage with no decimals. Then I'll hide the field label for the initiative, and I'll format the initiative values to be a little bit larger and a little bit darker. Going back to our dashboard, I'll add our progress lines worksheet. I can remove the legend, hide the title, and I'll resize it. Then I'll set this to fill the entire view. I'm also going to resize the boxes a little bit, and then I'll copy and paste one of our other titles and call this one Business Initiatives. By using these techniques, we've taken a Tableau dashboard beyond the basic charts, so we can effectively track market trends and business goals.